I froze in the middle of the mall because I saw my daughter counting coins at a food court table. Not casually, not out of habit. She was sorting them one by one like she had to choose between coffee and something else. This was Hannah. My daughter, who used to drive a new SUV, who never checked prices, who never looked this small. Her clothes were worn, her phone screen cracked, and she kept glancing toward the exits, like she was afraid someone would notice us talking. I sat down and asked where her money went. She tried to smile, but fear showed first. Then she leaned closer and whispered that her husband and his mother took everything, the accounts, the mail, the paperwork, even the money meant for her own child. And sitting there surrounded by people spending freely, I felt something break inside me. My daughter was broke in the one place no one ever looks, in plain sight. The woman sitting near the edge of the food court looked tired, smaller somehow, folded in on herself, like she was trying not to take up space. This was a place built for spending money, for wandering with bags in your hands and music in the background. It did not make sense that my daughter would belong to this picture. Then she tucked her hair behind her ear. I knew that movement the way you know your own reflection. Something inside me dropped hard and fast. My chest tightened, and for a moment I just stood there, a man in his 60s, frozen between a coffee counter and a truth he was not ready for. Hannah was counting coins in her palm. Not casually, not like someone emptying a pocket. She was sorting them carefully, separating quarters from the rest, lining them up as if precision mattered. Pennies, nickels, dimes, a few quarters she touched twice before setting aside. I watched my daughter measure what she could afford in public. People passed her without noticing. A couple laughed at a phone screen. A teenager balanced a tray with too much food. A father carried a little boy on his shoulders past the toy store. The mall kept moving, bright and loud and indifferent. I told myself to breathe. I told myself not to rush in like a man who might make things worse. I had spent years believing that giving my daughter space was the same as trusting her. Standing there, I wondered for the first time if that belief had been a convenient excuse. I walked over slowly. When my shadow crossed the table, Hannah looked up so quickly it startled me. Her eyes widened, then softened into a smile that did not reach them. "Dad, what are you doing here?" She pulled the coins toward herself, closing her hand around them, as if she had been caught doing something wrong. I sat down across from her and kept my voice even. I had a meeting nearby. Thought I would grab coffee. I looked at her face, really looked this time. "What is going on, Hannah?" Her eyes dropped to the table, then lifted and moved past me. Left, right, toward the entrance. The way people look when they are checking for someone. Nothing she said. Just running errands. Errands. With loose change. "Your car is not out there," I said quietly. "I did not see it when I came in." Her jaw tightened. She swallowed and did not answer. I leaned forward a little, lowering my voice so it stayed between us. "Where did your money go?" She did not look at me right away. Her gaze drifted to my hands, to the watch I had worn for years, to the ring on my finger, that I never took off, even after her mother and I went our separate ways. Then she looked away again. "Dad, not here. Please." I noticed things I should have noticed sooner. The way her sweatshirt was faded at the cuffs. The crack across her phone screen that someone had learned to live with instead of fixing. The slight hollow under her cheekbones. "You are shaking," I said. "I am fine." She was not. But I waited. I had learned over a lifetime that the truth does not come when you demand it. It comes when someone feels safe enough to let it out. Hannah let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, except it carried no humor. I just needed enough for a coffee, she said. Noah wanted something from the bakery, and I told him maybe next time. My grandson, 6 years old, a child who still trusted that adults knew what they were doing. Where is he now? I asked. She nodded toward the play area. I followed her eyes and saw a small boy in a blue hoodie climbing carefully, then jumping down as if the floor might disappear. He smiled to himself, proud of something only he understood. I felt a small release in my chest. Hannah watched him the way you watch a candle in a room with open windows. Dad, she said, and her voice cracked on the word. Talk to me, I said. Just enough. I can handle the rest. She stared at the coins in her hand. Her voice dropped so low I had to lean closer to hear it. Ryan and Patricia took everything. I did not ask her to explain who they were. I knew. Her husband, her mother-in-law, the people who were supposed to be her safety, took everything how I asked. She shook her head fast and small. They handle the accounts. Ryan says it is easier that way. Less stress for me. Patricia says women make emotional decisions with money. She always says it with a smile like it is a joke. Her eyes moved again, scanning the food court. Is Ryan here? I asked. No, he is at work. But Patricia knows I bring Noah here sometimes. She likes to know where I am, keep track. The words sat heavy between us. I felt anger rise hot and old, the kind that makes men forget consequences. I pressed my hands flat against the table until it passed. Do you have access to your own paycheck, Hannah? She hesitated. That pause answered more than words ever could. He changed the deposit, she said. I do not even remember when. I just noticed there was less. Then he started giving me cash. 20 here, 30 there, like I am asking for allowance. Her voice tightened. The mail goes to his office now. Patricia said it was safer. I cannot find my own paperwork. I could not find Noah's insurance card last week. She rubbed the edge of a dime with her thumb over and over. I wanted to stand up and confront Ryan where he stood. I wanted to do something loud and final. Instead, I stayed seated. I stayed quiet. I had learned the hard way that noise can be used against you. Hannah glanced toward the entrance again, and her shoulders lifted as if she expected someone to call her name. We are not doing this here, I said. Not where you feel like you have to watch the doors. She looked at me, and for a second she looked younger, like the girl who used to climb into my lap during thunderstorms. I should not have let it get this far, she said. The words landed harder than any accusation. I felt my own guilt surface the years I had told myself that stepping back was respect, not avoidance. I stood and held out my hand, not insisting, just offering. Let me take you and Noah to dinner, I said. Somewhere quiet. We will eat. We will talk. No pressure. She stared at my hand, then closed her fingers around the coins and slipped them into her pocket, as if hiding proof of something. Finally, she nodded once. Okay. As we walked toward the play area together, Noah ran over, smiling, and grabbed Hannah's hand. She glanced at her phone before slipping it into her bag, a quick nervous check, and the sight of that small habit stayed with me as we left the noise of the mall behind. The drive away from the mall was quiet. Noah hummed in the back seat, his shoes tapping together in a rhythm only he understood. Hannah watched the road slide past her reflection, drifting in and out of the window glass. I kept my eyes forward, hands steady on the wheel, telling myself that calm was something I could still provide. As the traffic thinned, my thoughts filled the space. I kept replaying moments I had dismissed over the years. Small things. Silences. The confidence with which I had told myself that giving my daughter space was the same as being a good father. When Hannah married Ryan in 2016, I remember the way I stood back on purpose. I believed a father's role was to raise a child and then step aside. I had said it out loud more than once, like it was a rule worth defending. Independence mattered to me. I thought it was something you honored by not interfering. Ryan seemed capable. He spoke easily. He shook my hand with confidence and looked me in the eye. I remember telling myself that men like that did not need watching. Patricia was there too, always moving, always adjusting something. She called Hannah sweetheart and smiled as if she were managing a household instead of a wedding. I noticed her presence but chose not to question it. I told myself families blend in different ways. I told myself it was not my place. Those decisions felt neat at the time. On the road, they felt careless. We stopped at a small family restaurant a few miles from the mall. Vinyl booths, laminated menus, a familiar smell of fried food and coffee. The hostess greeted Noah by name and handed him crayons without asking. That detail stayed with me. It told me Hannah came here when she needed to disappear without being questioned. We slid into a booth near the window. Noah climbed in beside me and began coloring with quiet concentration. Hannah sat across from us, her shoulders still drawn in. Her phone lay face down on the table, close enough that she could feel it vibrate if it did. I waited until we ordered. I waited until Noah was absorbed in his drawing. Then I asked her to tell me how it started. She took a moment. Then she said it was supposed to make things easier. Ryan had said moving money around was inefficient. One account made sense. Patricia had agreed. She said that was how responsible families handled things. Hannah explained how sometime in 2021 Ryan suggested combining everything. He liked spreadsheets and budgets. He liked control disguised as organization. Patricia reinforced it by framing it as support. Less stress. More focus on being a mother. The words sounded gentle. They landed heavy. At first Hannah did not mind. Noah was small. She was tired. Not thinking about bills felt like relief. Her paycheck went into an account she stopped checking. Then into one she could not access at all. Ryan took over paying expenses. Patricia offered to help keep things in order. The mail stopped coming to the house and started going to Ryan's office. It happened gradually, Hannah said. Questions came later. She would ask about groceries and Ryan would want details. Not accusing, just curious. Patricia would laugh and say, "Men like structure." Hannah laughed too at first because it was easier than arguing. Noah looked up from his coloring and asked about dessert. Hannah smiled quickly and told him to finish his meal. When he went back to his crayons, her smile faded. Ryan started giving me cash, she said. Small amounts. He said it helped with budgeting. Patricia said discipline was good for families. Discipline. The word settled in my chest. I had used it myself once, talking about work and schedules and responsibility. I wondered how many times it had been used against my daughter without me knowing. I asked her how much. $20, $30, sometimes $50 if I made a point about groceries. She said it flatly, like she was reciting numbers instead of describing her life. Then there was the paperwork, the house, refinancing. Ryan said rates were good. Patricia said it would protect them long term. Hannah signed where she was told. She trusted the man she married. She trusted the woman who kept calling it family. "Did you read it?" I asked. She shook her head once. The table felt smaller after that. I thought about my own past, about the deal that nearly cost me my business years ago. I had trusted a man who spoke confidently and smiled easily. I had learned that lesson the hard way. I realized I had never warned Hannah about it, not seriously. I had assumed she would learn on her own. That assumption sat heavy. I should have said something sooner, Hannah said. I should have told you. I wanted to absolve her. Instead, I told her the truth that mattered. I should have asked more questions. I should not have assumed that silence meant stability. She looked at me then, and something in her face softened. It was relief, not forgiveness, but it mattered. No one ever asks, she said. They just assume you are fine. We finished eating. Noah leaned back, satisfied, his dinosaur colored in careful shades of green and blue. I paid the check without thinking. Hannah noticed. The look on her face was gratitude tangled with embarrassment. Outside, the evening air had cooled. We walked to the car together. Noah climbed into the back seat, still talking about his drawing. Hannah paused before getting in. She hesitated, then spoke quietly. Dad, if Ryan finds out I talked to you, it will not go well. I looked at her. That was the first time she had said it out loud. What do you mean? I asked. She glanced at her phone and slipped it into her bag. He does not like surprises. I started the engine and pulled out of the lot. As we drove, her phone vibrated once in her bag. She did not check it. Neither did I, but the sound stayed with me. By the time I dropped them off, a thought had settled in, clear and unwelcome. This was not one mistake or one bad decision. It was a pattern built slowly, protected by politeness and silence. And patterns like that do not correct themselves. They wait for someone to finally see them for what they are. By the time I got home that night, the house felt smaller than usual. The quiet had weight to it. I sat at the kitchen table with the lights low, staring at the place where Hannah's phone had buzzed earlier, replaying that sound until it stopped feeling distant and started feeling personal. Patterns, once you notice them, do not let you sleep. The next morning, I stopped telling myself to wait. I had learned the hard way years ago that confusion feeds on hesitation. When I lost my construction company, it was not because money vanished overnight. It was because I trusted the wrong explanations and waited too long to ask the right questions. That lesson had cost me everything I had built. I was not about to watch the same thing happen again from the sidelines. I called Chris Martinez before I could talk myself out of it. Chris answered with the same calm voice I remembered from years back. I told him I needed help looking into a family situation. Financial, legal, quiet. I did not give names yet. I did not need to. He told me money leaves tracks whether people want it to or not. Bank records, property filings, tax documents, rental listings. You follow what is public first, then you decide what comes next. He did not promise speed. He promised process. That was enough. We met later that afternoon at his office in Plano. Nothing about the building stood out. Beige walls, trim hedges, a place designed to be forgotten. Chris looked the same as he always had, observant, unrushed. He listened without interrupting while I laid out what I knew. Hannah's paycheck, the combined accounts, the refinance, the missing mail, the cash allowances that never quite added up. Chris wrote things down and asked only the questions that mattered. What names were on the property? Where the house was located? When the refinance happened? He explained what he could access legally and what would require Hannah's involvement. He stayed inside the lines. I respected that. People think money disappears, he said. It almost never does. It just moves to places people assume no one will look. That sentence followed me all the way home. The waiting started then. Days measured by small tasks and short messages. I checked on Hannah without pressing. She replied with brief updates. Fine. Busy. Thanks again. I could hear the restraint in her words, the careful distance she was trying to keep in place. On the third day, Chris called. I found something he said. It took some digging. You should come by. We sat across from each other in his office again. He slid a folder toward me slower this time. Inside were printouts from public records and online listings. A property address in Frisco. Hannah and Ryan's house. I felt a strange calm settle in. Recognition, not surprise. The house was listed as a short-term rental. The listing was clean and anonymous. Neutral photos, minimal description. The kind of place designed to disappear into a stream of options. The account receiving the payments is under Ryan's name only, Chris said. No sign of Hannah attached to it. I stared at the page longer than I needed to. I imagined Hannah counting coins at the mall while strangers stayed in her home paying for access she did not control. So the house is generating income, I said. Yes, and it has been for a while. Chris explained how rental income creates tax records and how tax records lead to filings. Filings create patterns. Patterns show intent when viewed over time. He spoke evenly like this was just another case. For me, it felt like watching a door open that I had not known existed. This does not prove everything, yet he said, but it proves control. Control. The words settled into place with an uncomfortable precision. As I drove home, memories from my own past surfaced without asking permission. The meeting where I realized my business partner had been moving funds without telling me. The moment I understood that trust does not protect you from math. I had sworn I would never ignore signs like that again. And yet here I was, watching them surface in my daughter's life. I called Hannah that evening. I kept my voice steady. I told her I had started looking into things, that I was not making accusations, that I wanted facts. There was a pause on the line before she spoke. Dad, she said quietly, please be careful. I asked her what she meant. She hesitated, then said Ryan had asked a few questions that morning. About paperwork. About whether she had talked to anyone. Patricia had mentioned something about being careful who you trust. The line went quiet again. I promised Hannah I would move slowly, carefully. I meant it. After the call, I sat at my desk and spread out the papers Chris had given me. I noticed details I had skimmed before. Dates, amounts, patterns repeating themselves. This was not chaos, it was organized, thought out. I thought about Noah. About the way he had asked for dessert without knowing why the answer was always maybe next time. I imagined him growing up inside rules he never agreed to. By the time I turned off the light, my confusion had shifted into something sharper. Not anger yet. Awareness. Direction. Money had not disappeared. It had been redirected. And now that I knew where to look, I also knew this was only the first door that would open. Once I understood where to look, it became impossible to pretend that the damage stopped at numbers on a page. A few days later, Hannah asked if Noah could stay with me for the afternoon. She said she had errands. She did not explain which ones, and I did not ask. By the time she dropped him off, I had already decided that I would pay attention to everything he said, even the things that sounded small. We spread out plastic blocks on the living room floor and started building towers that leaned more than they stood. Noah laughed every time one tipped over. His laugh was easy. It filled the room the way laughter is supposed to. I told myself this would be simple. Just an afternoon of being a grandfather. Without looking up from the blocks, Noah said that his dad says his mom is bad with money. The sentence landed quietly. It did not echo. It did not ask for a reaction. It simply existed. I did not answer right away. I took a breath I did not know I was holding and asked him where he heard that. Dad says it, he said. Grandma too. Grandma says you do not understand how our family works. He pushed another block into place and smiled at how steady it felt. I asked him what that meant. He shrugged. Grandma knows things. She says there are rules. If you break them, things get taken away. Taken away how? I asked. He paused then. His fingers hovered over the blocks as if he had to think carefully before choosing the right one. Like toys, or TV or other stuff. He did not say people, but he did not need to. The rest of the afternoon moved slowly. Noah colored pictures at the table while I watched him from the kitchen, the words replaying themselves in my head. Rules. Taken away. The kind of language that seeps in early and stays. When Hannah came back, Noah ran to her with the kind of joy that makes adults feel both proud and guilty. He hugged her tightly, then went to pack up his drawings. I asked Hannah how much room she felt she had in her own house. She leaned against the counter and stared at the sink. Her answer came out measured, like she had rehearsed it for herself many times. I do not decide when we travel. I do not decide what we spend. I do not decide where paperwork goes. I do not decide which room I work in anymore. She paused. Sometimes I feel like I am visiting my own life. I asked her if she had ever reached out for help before. She nodded. Once. Late at night after an argument that left her shaking. She told me she called the police and tried to explain that she did not have access to her own money, that she felt trapped, that she did not know what would happen if she pushed back. They listened, she said. They were polite. Then they told me there was nothing criminal they could act on. They said it was a civil matter. They suggested counseling, mediation, time. After that, she stopped calling anyone. That evening, Noah stayed the night. We ordered pizza and watched a movie he had already memorized. Halfway through, he leaned against me, heavy with trust. His breathing slowed. The screen flickered across his face. Then, without turning his head, he asked if moms can get taken away. I did not answer immediately. I stared at the television until the scene changed, buying myself a few seconds I needed. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady, even though my hands were not. I told him moms do not get taken away for making mistakes. I told him families are supposed to protect each other. I told him he was safe. He nodded and went back to watching the movie. But I felt something break loose inside me, something that had been holding together out of habit rather than strength. Later that night, after Noah fell asleep, Hannah and I stood on the porch while the house settled around us. She told me Ryan had been asking questions that morning about paperwork, about why she needed copies of documents. Patricia had mentioned that it was important to be careful who you trust. Hannah looked at her phone and turned it face down like it might interrupt us if given the chance. She also told me there was another refinance document Ryan wanted her to sign. Soon. That was the moment waiting stopped being an option. I told Hannah I was calling a lawyer. She did not argue. She did not agree right away either. She just nodded, fear and relief sharing the same space on her face. Will that make things worse? She asked. I told her that letting things continue as they were was already doing that. When she drove away with Noah, I stood on the porch longer than I needed to. The street was quiet. The sound of the car faded. Inside, I sat at the table and opened my laptop. I typed family law attorney and the name of the city. I did not scroll aimlessly. I did not hesitate. This was no longer about money alone. It was about what a child learns when control is dressed up as care. It was about the damage that happens quietly, the kind that does not leave bruises, but leaves beliefs. I closed the laptop and picked up my phone. The decision felt firm in my hand. Some problems announce themselves with noise. Others wait patiently for someone to finally say enough. The next morning, I made the call I had been circling for days. I did not explain everything over the phone. I asked for a consultation and gave my name. When they offered an appointment later that week, I said yes without checking my calendar. Hannah came with me. She sat in the passenger seat, the whole drive, hands folded, eyes forward. She looked calmer than she had the night before, but it was the calm that comes from deciding to move, not from feeling safe. Laura Bennett's office was in a low building near downtown Plano, the kind with frosted glass and quiet hallways. Nothing dramatic. That felt right. Laura herself was the same. She shook our hands, asked us to sit, and listened. She did not promise anything. She did not raise her voice or soften it. She asked for dates, numbers, documents. She asked Hannah when her paycheck changed, when the refinance happened, when the mail stopped coming home. She wrote everything down without interrupting. Law does not move fast, she said, but it does move if you give it something to work with. She explained what she would need: tax returns, bank statements, copies of any refinance agreements, rental records if they existed. She warned us that missing documents were common in cases like this, that silence and delay often worked in favor of the person holding the paperwork. Time is not neutral, she said. It always benefits someone. We left with a list and a sense of direction that felt fragile but real. The days that followed blurred together. Hannah dug through old email accounts. She requested records she had not seen in years. Some links were dead. Some passwords had been changed. Each small barrier carried its own message. While we worked, the phone calls started. Patricia called first. Her voice was smooth, concerned. She told Hannah she was worried about how this would look, about family, about Noah. She said lawyers made everything worse. She said strong families handled things privately. Hannah listened without responding and ended the call with shaking hands. Ryan's message came later that evening. An email this time. Polite. Measured. He asked Hannah to think about their son. He said legal conflict would be hard on a child. He suggested they talk things out at home. Hannah read it twice and closed her laptop. I watched all of this from close range, close enough to see the pressure building. Not loud, not obvious, persistent. We met Laura again at the end of the week with what we had managed to collect. She spread the documents across her desk and began arranging them by year: salary statements, tax filings, refinance paperwork, rental records that Chris had helped identify. She worked quietly for a long time. Then she paused. She turned one page slightly and looked at Hannah. "Do you remember signing this attachment?" she asked. Hannah leaned forward, her brow furrowed. "I remember signing the main document, not that." Laura nodded. The signature looked like Hannah's, but not entirely. The spacing was off, the pressure uneven. "I am not saying anything yet," Laura said, "only that this deserves a closer look, and that if more documents are coming, we need them sooner rather than later." Hannah swallowed. "What happens if we wait?" she asked. Laura did not hesitate. Waiting helps the person who wants things to stay exactly as they are. The drive home was quiet again, different from before, heavier but steadier. That night, Hannah told me Ryan had asked if she was meeting anyone. Patricia had sent a text about trust, about loyalty, about how quickly misunderstandings could spiral. Hannah showed me the message and turned her phone face down. I felt the urge to push back hard, to confront, to demand answers. Laura's words kept me in my seat. Law moves slow, but it moves. The next few days were filled with small steps that felt larger than they looked. Requests sent, calls returned, documents scanned. Each action carried weight because it pointed in one direction. Hannah called me one evening, her voice low. "Ryan says the refinance paperwork needs to be finalized next week," she said. "He wants me to sign something else." That was the moment the waiting changed shape. I told her not to sign anything without showing it to Laura. I told her to take pictures if she had to. I told her we were not alone in this anymore. After the call, I sat at my desk and stared at the list Laura had given us. It was not dramatic. It was not satisfying. It was work. But it was movement. For the first time since I saw my daughter counting coins, the situation no longer felt like a fog. It felt like a narrow road, slow, unforgiving, but real. And once you step onto a road like that, there is no pretending you do not know where it leads. I felt the weight of that road the next time my phone rang. It was Chris Martinez. His voice was calm, but there was a different tone underneath it, the kind that tells you the puzzle is starting to show its picture. "I finished what you asked," he said. "There is more than one stream here. You are going to want to see it in person." I met him that afternoon in the same quiet office park in Plano. I remember noticing the ordinary things, the sun on the windshield, the smell of hot pavement, the way people carried on with their day, as if nothing in the world was coming apart. I walked into Chris's office with a folder under my arm and a knot in my stomach that refused to loosen. Chris handed me a thicker folder than before. He had organized it the way a man organizes something he does not want anyone to argue with. Dates, addresses, transfers, screenshots, public records, everything lined up like a trail through brush. He started with the rental income. The Frisco house was listed consistently. The bookings were regular. The payments went into an account in Ryan's name alone. Not sometimes. Every time. Chris showed me a series of deposits that looked almost boring in their pattern. That was the worst part. It did not look like a mistake. It looked like a system. I asked if any of it touched Hannah. "No," Chris said. "Not on paper." He moved to the next section. Documents. There were edits to forms that appeared after Hannah signed, not in a way that would jump out at a casual glance. A changed address, a different routing number, an attachment added. A signature that matched closely enough to pass if no one compared it to the real one side by side. "It is subtle," Chris said. "Someone who knows what they are doing or someone who has done it before." My hands tightened on the edge of the folder. I thought about Hannah signing papers while Noah needed attention, while dinner was cooking, while Ryan spoke in that confident tone men use when they want you to stop asking questions. Chris did not dramatize it. He did not need to. Then he showed me something that made my stomach turn in a different way. A set of emails and messages Hannah had found in an old account and forwarded to me. Chris had cross-referenced them with dates on filings and transactions. The language was polite, family-friendly, concerned. Patricia wrote the way some people do when they want control without sounding controlling. She talked about stability. She talked about how stressful money can be for women. She talked about keeping things simple for the sake of the child. In one message, she suggested Ryan change where the mail went so Hannah would not have to worry about it. In another, she praised him for being firm, for keeping the household disciplined, for not letting emotions interfere with decisions. Chris tapped the page lightly. "You asked me who is driving this," he said. "I cannot say that in a legal sense, but I can tell you whose voice keeps showing up right before the changes happen." I stared at Patricia's name on the screen and felt something settle into place. This was not a single man deciding to be cruel. This was a family culture being enforced. A mother teaching a son how to manage a wife as if she were an expense line. The realization was quieter than anger, but it cut deeper. It meant the problem would not be solved by one conversation. It meant it was baked into the way they saw power. When I left Chris's office, I did not go home right away. I sat in my car and called Hannah. I told her Chris had found more and that she needed to meet with Laura as soon as possible. Hannah agreed, but I could hear the fear rising again. The closer we got to action, the more she sensed what it might trigger. 2 days later, Hannah and I sat in Laura Bennett's office with the new folder on her desk. Laura did not react the way people do in movies. She did not lean back and whistle. She did not say, "This is huge." She read. She highlighted. She asked Hannah to confirm dates. She asked me to explain how the rental listing was verified. She asked what records were public and what records were obtained through Hannah's own access. She was building a clean chain link by link. While she worked, Hannah's phone buzzed twice in her purse. She did not answer. I watched her eyes flick toward the bag each time, the way a person watches a door they expect to open. Laura finally looked up. "This is enough to move," she said. Hannah's face tightened. Enough to move sounded like a relief, but it also sounded like a cliff edge. Move how Hannah asked. Laura spoke in terms that were simple but not soft. She said they could file for temporary orders, immediate protections, financial access, a temporary custody arrangement that ensured Noah stayed stable and safe while the court sorted out the facts. She explained that family court could act quickly in some areas if the request was specific and supported. She also said something else, something I needed to hear. "If you wait," Laura said, "you will be responding to whatever they do next. If you act now, you will be setting the pace." Hannah stared down at her hands. The skin around her knuckles was pale. She nodded once, barely. "There is one more thing," Laura said. "If Ryan is asking her to sign another refinance document, we need to stop that from happening. Today. Do not sign anything. Do not agree to meet alone. Do not warn them about the filing." I felt a surge of protective instinct, the kind that wants to pick up a phone and say stop. Laura's expression kept that instinct in check. "We do this clean," she said. "We do it right." As we left her office, Hannah's phone buzzed again. This time she looked at the screen. She did not read it out loud, but I could see her shoulders stiffen. "He is asking where I am," she said. I looked at my daughter and saw the trap tightening as we tried to pull her out of it. A man can control money. A man can control paperwork. But the deeper control is the one that makes someone afraid to answer a simple question. In the parking lot, Hannah asked me if this was really going to work. I told her the truth. "I do not know how they will react," I said. "But I know what happens if we do nothing." That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the folder open and Laura's next steps written on a legal pad. The plan was not dramatic. It was slow, procedural, and heavy with consequences. For the first time, the fight had a shape, a timeline, a place to stand. And once you bring something into the light of a courthouse, it stops being a private misunderstanding. It becomes a record, a set of facts that strangers will read and weigh. I turned off the light and listened to the house settle around me, knowing the next phase would not be quiet. I did not sleep much after that. Not because I was afraid of what the court would do, but because I was afraid of what Ryan would do when he realized Hannah was no longer moving on his schedule. The filing went in the next morning. Laura handled the mechanics. Hannah handled the fear. I handled the waiting. We did not announce anything. We did not argue. We let the process do what it was built to do, which is bring private control into public view. By the time we arrived at the courthouse in Plano for the temporary orders conference and mediation, Hannah's hands were cold. She kept rubbing her thumb across her fingers like she was trying to warm them. Noah was not with us. Laura had insisted he should not be anywhere near this. I agreed. The hallway outside the mediation rooms was quiet in the way government buildings are quiet, not peaceful, just controlled. People sat with folders on their laps. Lawyers spoke in low voices. The air smelled like paper and disinfectant. Janet Reynolds introduced herself with a firm handshake and a calm face. She looked like someone who had spent years watching people try to turn emotion into leverage. She led us into a small room with a table, a few chairs, and a box of tissues that no one touched. Ryan arrived with an attorney I had never met. Ryan looked polished the way he always had. Clean shirt, straight posture, a calm that he probably practiced in the mirror. Patricia came in behind him and sat close enough to remind everyone who she was without saying a word. Hannah stiffened the moment she saw them. I could feel it beside me like a current. She did not speak, she did not look away either. She sat down with her shoulders back, and I saw something new in her face. It was fear, yes, but it was also resolve. Janet began the way mediators do. She set expectations, no interruptions. One person speaks at a time. Focus on the child. Focus on facts. Ryan nodded like he agreed with the concept of fairness. Patricia folded her hands and stared at the table. Laura opened our folder. She did not make speeches. She placed documents on the table in an order that told its own story. Hannah's pay statements, the change in direct deposit, the absence of her access, then the property listing for the Frisco house, dates, screenshots, the payment trail to an account in Ryan's name only. Ryan's attorney leaned forward and scanned the pages. Ryan tried to keep his expression neutral, but his jaw tightened at the rental listing. Patricia's eyes flicked once, then settled back down as if looking away could make the paper less real. Janet asked Ryan to respond. Ryan cleared his throat and spoke carefully, the way men do when they want to sound reasonable. We did what made sense for our family. Hannah gets anxious about money. My mom helped us organize. I took on the responsibility. Laura did not react. She turned a page and slid it forward. This is not about organizing. This is about control. This is rental income from the marital home being redirected to an account Hannah cannot access. Ryan's attorney said something about business decisions and household management. Laura waited until he finished, then asked one question. If it is family money, why is it not in a family account? Ryan's eyes moved to his attorney, then back to the table. Janet asked about the refinance attachment. Laura did not accuse. She pointed out inconsistencies. A signature that looked close but not identical. An attachment Hannah did not recognize. A routing number that changed after the initial signing date. Ryan's calm began to thin. Not in a dramatic way. In a way that showed up in small movements. His foot tapping once, his hand tightening around a pen, his gaze shifting to Patricia, as if expecting her to step in the way she always had. Patricia did not speak. She did not correct. She did not guide. She sat very still, watching the room, as if she had finally realized she could not control it. Janet's voice stayed even. This is not the place to determine fraud, but it is the place to determine what is stable and safe for a child while the court sorts it out. Ryan's attorney asked for a private conversation. Janet gave them time. Ryan leaned toward Patricia for a moment. I watched his mouth move. I watched Patricia's hands tighten, then loosen again. For the first time, she looked older, tired, like the role she had played so confidently had finally met something stronger than opinion. When they returned, Ryan's attorney spoke. We are willing to agree to temporary access and temporary guidelines, without admitting wrongdoing. Laura nodded as if she expected nothing less. The agreement came together in pieces. Hannah would regain access to accounts relevant to household and child expenses. She would have independent access to her income going forward. Noah's routine would be maintained. Exchanges would be structured and documented. Decisions about school and medical care would require joint input, not unilateral control. Ryan objected to certain phrases. Laura adjusted wording. Janet guided the flow. It was not a victory you could cheer for. It was a door opening slowly, and once open, it could not be closed the same way again. When Hannah signed the temporary order, her hand trembled. Then it steadied. She put the pen down and exhaled the first full breath I had seen her take in weeks. Ryan signed too. His face stayed composed, but something in his posture had changed. He was still a man who wanted control. He was just learning what it felt like to lose it one line of legal language at a time. Outside the courthouse, the sky was pale and wide. The air felt cleaner than it had any right to. Hannah walked beside me quietly, her folder held against her chest like a shield. She did not smile. She did not cry. She just looked forward, as if she was trying to remember what it felt like to move through the world without asking permission. Noah was waiting at my house with a neighbor I trusted. When we pulled into the driveway, he ran out waving his drawing from the other day. Hannah knelt and hugged him, holding on a little longer than usual. Noah hugged back without hesitation. Children know when something has shifted, even if they cannot name it. That evening, after Noah fell asleep on the couch with his blanket pulled up to his chin, Hannah sat at my kitchen table and stared at the temporary order again. She traced the lines with her finger, as if she needed to believe the words were real. I made tea and set it in front of her. She took a sip and looked up at me. "What happens now?" she asked. I did not have a clean answer. The process would continue. There would be more documents, more hearings, more pressure. Ryan and Patricia would not accept this quietly, not for long. But for the first time, Hannah had a footing. Now I said, we keep going. We do it the right way. And we do not let them pull you back into the dark. The weeks that followed did not bring fireworks or sudden relief. They brought routines, paperwork, appointments written on calendars. Quiet progress that only makes sense when you look back at it later. Hannah started meeting with a financial counselor Laura recommended. Someone who spoke plainly and did not assume she knew nothing. They went over budgets, access accounts, and rights. Hannah asked questions she had been trained not to ask before. I watched her shoulders relax inch by inch as she realized knowledge was not a threat. It was a tool. She also agreed to see a therapist, not because she was broken, but because control leaves marks you do not always see until someone helps you name them. She told me afterward that the hardest part was admitting how small her world had become without her noticing. Noah adjusted in his own way. He slept better at my house. He asked fewer questions about rules and more about when we could go to the park. The language he used softened. Children are quick to relearn safety when it is offered consistently. Ryan did not disappear. He became quieter. Communication went through attorneys more often than not. Decisions were documented. Financial authority was no longer his alone. He pushed back where he could, but the ground beneath him had shifted. He was no longer the only one holding the map. Patricia faded from the center of things. Her messages stopped coming as often. Her advice was no longer treated as guidance. Influence, I learned, depends on access. Once access is limited, influence follows. Watching all of this unfold taught me something I had misunderstood for most of my life. I had always thought money was about survival, paying bills, providing, keeping things running. I thought control over money was just another form of responsibility. I was wrong. Money is also a voice. It is the ability to say no without fear. It is the space to make a mistake without punishment. When one person holds all of it, everyone else learns to whisper. Karma did not arrive with shouting or revenge. It arrived with paperwork stamped and filed, with signatures witnessed, with boundaries enforced quietly by people who did not care about anyone's version of the story, only what could be proven. That kind of justice does not feel dramatic in the moment. It feels steady. It lasts longer. There were days Hannah wanted to give up. Days she worried she was overreacting. Days she felt guilty for changing the rules of a system she had once agreed to. On those days, I reminded her that consent given without information is not consent at all. I also reminded myself of something harder. Silence can look like trust. Sometimes it is just comfort. If I had asked more questions years ago, this story might have taken a different shape. That thought stays with me, not as regret, but as responsibility. Families do not break all at once. They bend slowly, often in ways that look practical on the surface. It is easy to miss when control is wrapped in concern, when restriction is framed as care. If you are listening to this and something feels familiar, pay attention to the small things. Who decides? Who has access? Who asks permission? Especially when money starts flowing in one direction and explanations flow in the other. Talk sooner than you think you need to. Ask questions that feel uncomfortable. Teach your children that partnership means shared ground, not silent agreement. If this story made you pause or think of someone you care about, stay here. These stories exist because they happen quietly, and because someone eventually chooses to notice. Sometimes the most important changes do not announce themselves. They wait for someone willing to listen and then act.